They always told me the past was fixed, something you could trust more than the present. But the morning I found the letter about the Eldridge, I started to wonder if time itself was just another story someone decided to tell us. Welcome to MysteryCon. Before we dive deeper, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay tuned. I was alone in the archive room that October, the kind of place nobody visits unless they have a reason to be suspicious. Rows of steel cabinets lined the walls, each one labeled in that bureaucratic language that sounds neutral but means the opposite: classified, suppressed, unverified. I'd come here chasing what most people call a ghost story, the Philadelphia experiment. The legend said a Navy destroyer escort disappeared from the dock in 1943 and reappeared miles away, its crew half dead or fused to the metal. Even as a kid, I'd heard the rumors in fragments. My grandfather served on the Eldridge, but all I'd ever gotten out of him was a promise that someday, when the files were declassified, I'd understand why he came back a different man. It took me years to admit that I was working in his shadow. Every lead I followed felt personal, even if I pretended it was just another Cold War curiosity. But that morning, the fog was so dense over the Navy Yard, you couldn't see the water from the observation deck. I remember standing by the window with my thermos, watching shapes fade in and out: cranes, chain-link fences, the silhouette of a cargo ship that looked translucent through the mist. If I'd believed in omens, that would have been enough. The letter was in a folder stamped MISC. Correspondence 955. It wasn't catalogued in any index I'd seen. The paper was thin and brittle, typed in uneven black ink. The signature at the bottom read Carl M. Allen, though he signed it again in pen as Carlos Allende. My hands were steady, but I could feel something tightening behind my eyes as I read. He wrote about standing on the deck of another ship, watching the Eldridge fade like a mirage and reappear in a blue flash. He described men screaming, some disappearing, others embedded in bulkheads, arms and legs fused into the steel as if the ship had swallowed them whole. The details were too specific to dismiss, but too outlandish to believe outright. I scanned the letter twice before I realized my breathing had slowed to something shallow and ragged. It wasn't the first time I'd read about electromagnetic field experiments, but this was different. Allen sounded matter-of-fact, like he was reporting an inventory shipment rather than the collapse of reality. I pulled out my phone and took a few photos. The resolution was bad in the low light, but I wasn't willing to trust the only copy to the archives. Then I folded the letter and slid it into a fresh file folder. That was when I noticed a reference code in the margin TRD, Chronal T5. I didn't know what it meant yet. At the time, it felt like another piece of red tape. The archives had a chill to them that settled into my spine, the kind of cold you don't notice until you step outside. When I left the building, the sun was finally burning through the fog, casting everything in a pale, washed-out light. I stood there for a moment, thinking about what I'd promised my grandfather. I'd told him I'd find the truth, no matter how many decades it took. The problem was, I'd always assumed the truth would be something I could explain back in my rental car. I spread the other documents across the passenger seatship logs, test reports, crew lists. My grandfather's name was there, Petty Officer Thomas H. Keene, assigned to the Eldridge, present on October 28, 1943, and then transferred without explanation for months later to a naval hospital in Bethesda. The records ended there. No discharge papers, no cause for his hospitalization, just a blank space in the official story. I drove north along the river, past the old submarine pens. You can still see the concrete skeletons of the docks if you look closely, massive blocks pitted by salt and time. The Navy abandoned them decades ago, but some nights the water still churns in ways you can't quite account for. I thought about Alan's letter and the possibility that the ship hadn't just disappeared in space, but in time. It sounded absurd when I said it out loud, but so did men melting into walls. By the time I reached my officer, narrow suite on the top floor of a former textile warehouse, the light was already fading. My desk was cluttered with file boxes and half-empty coffee cups, the usual debris of long nights. I laid out everything in order. The Allende letter, my grandfather's personnel file, a handful of naval communiques referencing special electromagnetic trials. The pattern was there if you were willing to look at it sideways. I couldn't shake the sense that someone was watching me, though I hadn't seen another car on the road. Maybe it was just the pressure of too many late nights and too much caffeine. Or maybe it was the knowledge that stories like this don't stay buried because nobody cares. They stay buried because somebody cares too much. I turned on the desk lamp and sat back. The light caught the edges of a photograph I'd found months earlier in a declassified report, grainy, underexposed, but unmistakable. The Eldridge in dry dock, haloed in a pale corona of light. At first glance, it looked like a film defect, but the same glow appeared in other photos, from different angles, taken minutes apart. That was the moment the last piece of doubt started to slip away. If electromagnetic fields could bend light, what else could they bend? I rubbed my eyes and tried to focus. I knew the story had to start somewhere, and it wasn't in the legends or the whispered accounts of sailors in bars. It started with a promise to a man I barely knew. When I was 12, my grandfather sat me down on the porch of the old row house where he lived. He was in the final months of a cancer he never talked about, and he looked thinner than I'd ever seen him. He told me he'd seen something that day on the Eldridge, something that changed everything he understood about the world. He said it would be easy to dismiss it as a hoax because that's what people prefer, simple answers. But there were no simple answers here. He held my hand in his and made me promise I'd look for the truth when he was gone. So that's what I was, piecing together a story nobody wanted told. I looked out the office window at the last sliver of daylight over the rooftops. The shadows were long and sharp, the kind that make you feel like you're being watched. In the distance, a cargo helicopter drifted over the river, its running lights blinking in sequence. I watched it disappear behind the skyline and felt the old, familiar dread slide into place. If time travel was possible even in a crude, half-controlled wet meant nothing about the past was safe. The evidence wasn't a puzzle anymore, it was a threat. I reached for the Allende letter again, smoothing the creases with my palm. At the bottom of the page, Alan had scrawled something in blue ink, a note I hadn't noticed the first time. They will bury this, but not all of us forget. I read it twice, then once more, until the words felt as thin and brittle as the paper itself. And I understood something I'd never let myself admit before. If I kept going, there was no turning back. Still, I felt calmer than I had in weeks, because for the first time, the fog was lifting. And in the distance, I could see the shape of something I couldn't yet name proof. That the past wasn't a fixed point, it was a battlefield. It was late when I finally shut off the lamp in my office. The streets outside were nearly empty, the sidewalks slick from a cold drizzle that had started an hour earlier. I slipped the Allende letter and the photograph of the Eldridge into a folder I kept in my bag, double-checked the locks, and walked out into the night. Part of me kept expecting someone to step out of the shadows. Uniformed officer, a plainclothes agent, anybody with a badge, and too many questions. But the block was silent, except for the hum of a transformer across the street. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove to the National Naval Records Center, a place that felt more like a mausoleum than a working archive. Most researchers avoided the after-hours access policy that required 2 background checks and a handler to unlock the secured sections. But I'd cultivated a reputation as the kind of person willing to spend nights combing through boxes of microfilm nobody cared to touch. A clerk I knew, a thin man named McTeague, buzzed me in and gave me a tired nod. "You're back," he said, like it was both an observation and a mild reproach. "I need ship logs from October to December 43, I told him. USS Eldridge, and any associated convoy reports. McTeague didn't bother asking why. He disappeared behind a sliding panel of shelving. I stood there listening to the faint click of the retrieval mechanism as it moved along its track. When he returned, he set a crate on the counter and handed me a pair of cotton gloves. I carried everything to a reading station in the far corner, where the overhead lights had a habit of flickering. I didn't mind. I preferred it, if I was honest, made it easier to feel like nobody else was watching. Most of the logs were exactly what you'd expect, weather entries, supply inventories, dull administrative minutiae. But near the bottom of the stack, I found something different. A packet of photographs labeled simply Maintenance Confidential. They were black and white prints, grainy and smudged in places, but even so, the anomaly was obvious. One image in particular held my attention. The Eldridge was moored in what looked like dry dock, but the ship itself was wrong. A pale aura clung to the hull, a halo that seemed to distort the lines of the deck. I tilted the photo under the lamp, trying to convince myself it was just an exposure defect. But the glow had a texture, almost like it was etched into the negative itself. I pulled my phone out to snap a quick copy, but the screen went black. The battery had been at 80% when I came in. Now it wouldn't even power on. I set it aside, feeling my pulse start to rise. A minute later, McTeague reappeared. He had a look on his face I couldn't read, somewhere between curiosity and concern. He held out a scrap of yellow paper. "Someone called," he said. "Didn't leave a name, just this." I unfolded the note. 4 words were scrawled in a tight, careful hand. "Check the communications logs." I didn't ask McTeague who'd called. He wouldn't have known anyway. But the moment he left, I turned back to the records. Communications logs were separate, kept in a different catalogue entirely. I jotted down the relevant call numbers and took them back to the counter. McTeague didn't look thrilled about it, but he helped me pull the boxes back at the reading station. I flipped through transcripts of radio chatter, encoded teletype messages, official memoranda. Most were routine: convoy position updates, weather advisories, supply status reports. But toward the end of October, I found a series of messages that made me stop. Each began with a timestamp precise, down to the second, and an operational code I hadn't encountered before. TRD T5. The same reference Alan had scribbled in the margin of his letter. I read one dispatch twice. Cronell field test commenced. 304 hours. Results unstable. Visibility compromised. Crew exhibiting severe disorientation. Recommend immediate cessation of trial. It didn't read like a standard naval transmission. The language was almost clinical, detached in the face of something that sounded catastrophic. My eyes were burning by then, but I kept going. The next entry was shorter. Eldridge re-established visual contact. Hull integrity uncertain. Crew status undetermined. Further instructions pending. The minutes ticked by as I copied everything I could into my notes. My phone still wouldn't turn on. In the back of my mind, I wondered whether that was coincidence or something else entirely. I was about to pack up when a motion sensor light clicked on near the far wall. A figure stepped into the circle of illumination. Someone tall, wrapped in a dark overcoat. For a second, I couldn't breathe. But then I saw the face. A woman in her 50s, with a severe expression and a steel-grey bob. "Maya," I said, my voice catching. Maya Chen, the archivist I'd worked with on other requests. She looked tired, but her eyes were sharp. "Someone's monitoring your access logs," she said without preamble. "Which someone?" She glanced over her shoulder before stepping closer. "Defense Intelligence. Dyer. They put a hold on your last request for the Eldridge files. I tried to override it, but..." She trailed off, her gaze dropping to the photos spread across my work table. "Is this what you're looking for?" she asked. I nodded. Maya hesitated, then pulled a small flash drive from her coat pocket. "Take this," she said. "I don't want to know what you do with it. But you should know. They're already aware you're digging." She set the drive on the table. "Be careful, I mean it." Then she turned and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving me with the steady flicker of the overhead light. I didn't stay much longer. I packed everything into my bag, tucked the flash drive in my jacket, and walked out into the drizzle. The air smelled metallic, like wet concrete and old pipes. When I reached my car, I sat behind the wheel for a long time, trying to steady my breathing. My phone was still dead, but the battery had begun to feel warm in my hand, as if it were struggling against something I couldn't see. I drove back to my office, cutting through side streets to see if anyone was tailing me. If they were, they kept their distance. By the time I unlocked my door, it was past 3 in the morning. My hands were shaking as I booted up the old laptop I kept offline. The flash drive contained a single audio file and a folder of documents labeled Chrono resonance tests. The audio started with a burst of static, then a voicemail, midwesternaccent.com, in the way of someone trying not to panic. October 28th, test iteration 7. Primary field activated. Immediate anomalous readings. EM output exceeded threshold. Ship visibility compromised. Crew screaming. Light intensity god. The voice cut off in a wash of distortion. I played it again and again. Each time I felt a little more certain that none of this could be explained away as folklore or accident. Around dawn, I stepped out onto the fire escape. The city was waking up, commuters filing down the sidewalks with coffee in hand, oblivious to the fact that history might not be what they'd been told. Somewhere below, a delivery truck idled, the diesel engine rattling the iron grates under my boots. I watched the horizon turn pink, and for the first time in my life, I was certain of two things. I wasn't imagining this, and someone wanted me to stop. But that wasn't going to happen. I didn't sleep that morning. Instead, I sat by the window with a stale cup of coffee, watching the street outside my office slowly come alive. Delivery vans crawled past. Neighbors walked their dogs. It all looked so ordinary that, for a few minutes, I could almost pretend the last 12 hours hadn't happened. But then I'd remember the audio file, the flat calm in that man's voice as he described the impossible, and any sense of normalcy evaporated. Around 9, I called a contact I hadn't spoken to in years. His real name was probably buried under layers of aliases, but I knew him as Mr. Kane. He'd spent most of his career in the Defense Intelligence Agency and had hinted, in those careful, elliptical ways of intelligence people, that he'd seen operations that made conventional warfare look quaint. The last time we met, he'd told me there were programs so compartmentalized even the acronym designers didn't know what they stood for. I left a message on a secure line we'd set up ages ago, just a date and a place. He'd either show up, or he, WOULDN. By the time I pulled onto the interstate headed for New Jersey, my nerves were so raw I could feel every heartbeat in my teeth. The drive took 2 hours. I spent most of it rehearsing what I'd say if someone tried to stop me. In the glove compartment, I'd stashed photocopies of the documents just in case I needed leverage to prove I wasn't entirely crazy. The meeting point was a diner off Route 30, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been renovated. Since the Truman administration, Kane was already there when I walked in, sitting alone at a booth by the window. He wore the same nondescript overcoat and the same expression, polite interest covering something much colder. "Journalist," he said by way of greeting. "You look like hell." "Long night," I told him. He gestured to the opposite seat. I slid into the booth. The waitress brought me a cup of coffee without asking. Someone must have tipped her off I was coming. Kane stirred sugar into his cup without looking at me. "I've been following your trail," he said after a moment. "Did you really think you could sift through naval records and not set off any alarms?" I didn't answer. "You were flagged the moment you requested." "The communications logs," he went on. "The code you sortify, if that's not folklore, it's operational." He paused, watching my reaction. When I didn't speak, he sighed. "They called it the Temporal Reconnaissance Division, TRD for short. You're about 20 years too late to catch it in the act, but believe me, it was real." I studied him over the rim of my cup. What exactly were they trying to do? Kane's gaze drifted to the window, where the parking lot shimmered in the morning sun. They believed you could project a vessel, or even a person, outside linear time. Not just invisibility, but displacement. Imagine the advantage if you could scout a battlefield hours before the enemy even knew you were there. "Did it work?" I asked. He looked back at me then, and for a second, something like pity crossed his face. "It worked, sometimes, but it cost more than anyone anticipated." He leaned forward. "You know about Montauk?" I nodded. "The mind control rumors." "More than rumors," he said. "Montauk was the domestic end. But the Navy experiments, that was the first serious attempt to test coronal insertion. They thought they could train the brain to anchor itself when the body moved through time. Turns out, the mind doesn't like that. People came back, fragmented. I thought of the audio recording, the screaming. Fragmented how? Lost whole pieces of themselves, Kane said. Sometimes they'd forget where they were. Other times, they'd remember things that hadn't happened yet. The worst cases came back, convinced they'd died and been replaced. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thin manila envelope. Sliding it across the table, I hesitated before opening it. Inside were a dozen photocopied pages, memos, expense reports, and an organizational chart that sent a chill down my spine. DIA, Navy Research Bureau. A handful of private contractors I'd never heard of, and, unbelievably, a notation referencing a liaison from the Holy See, someone embedded in the Vatican's archives. I flipped to the last page, a project name in block capitals, Operation Heist. What the hell is this? I whispered. Insurance, Kane said. If you're serious about this story, you'll need to understand who you're dealing with. This isn't just an American project. The Vatican has its own reasons for keeping time off. I tried to process it all. Why me? Because you're the only one stupid enough to dig, he said, a hint of a smile. And because you have a personal stake. He tapped the table, signaling the end of the conversation. Be careful. You're walking into a cage. The bars aren't obvious until you're inside. When he left, I sat there a long time. The envelope still open in front of me. Every instinct told me to walk away. Go home. Pretend none of it mattered. But that was impossible now. On my way back to the car, I stopped short. Across the lot, a black SUV idled by the exit. Tinted windows, no plates. As I walked past, the engine turned over, but the driver never looked at me. I drove north again, but I didn't go straight back to the city. Instead, I took a detour along the coast, pulling off at a shuttered amusement pier. The wind off the water was sharp enough to sting. I stood by the railing, letting the cold clear my head. The envelope was tucked under my arm, but I didn't dare open it again out there in the open. Instead, I watched the waves break against the pilings. For a moment, I tried to picture what my grandfather must have felt standing on that deck in '43, knowing the world was about to shift under his feet. When I finally returned to my office. That night, I locked the door behind me and laid everything out. The chart, the Vatican references, the term chronal insertion, and the line that unsettled me most. Subjects returned with partial cognitive fusion. Long-term containment recommended. I read it again and again, feeling my stomach turn. Just before midnight, I turned on my recorder and spoke into the microphone. This is not a legend, not a campfire story. It's a program, a network, a deliberate effort to bend the timeline and bury anyone who gets too close. I didn't know who would ever hear those words, or if I'd live long enough to explain them. But saying it out loud felt like the first honest thing I'd done in years. And in that moment, I knew one more truth. Whatever happened next, I wouldn't be able to pretend this was just research anymore. It was personal. The days after my meeting with Kane passed in a blur of files, half-finished coffee, and the kind of quiet that feels less like peace and more like a warning. I kept my office dark most nights, the blinds drawn tight. It didn't matter. A part of me was sure that if someone wanted to know what I was doing, they already knew. I started by combing through the documents he'd given me. Most of them were dry billing records, project codes, military routing slips, but every few pages there would be a detail that made my pulse quicken. A line item referencing M stabilization chambers, a note about psi monitoring protocols, references to Vatican couriers transferring sealed crates out of Philadelphia in 1944. I filled a legal pad with questions I didn't know how to answer. What exactly had the Navy been testing? Why had the church been involved at all? And what had happened to the men who came back from wherever the Eldridge had gone? Late one evening, I called in a favor from Dr. Rafael Ortiz, a cryptographer I'd worked with on a decryption project years earlier. Rafael was the sort of person who could look at a page of redacted code words and find the seams everyone else missed. I didn't tell him everything over the phone, just that I needed help. cross-referencing some cipher patterns buried in declassified memos. Send them, he said simply. Give me a day. After I hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, my hand resting on the folder. I knew I was in over my head. But I also knew if I backed off now, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering what was waiting on the other side of all these half-buried secrets. When Raphael called back the next night, his voice was low and tight in that way it gets when he's genuinely rattled. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "Old files," I lied. "What did you find?" "It's not just a cipher," he said. "It's layered. Some of the code words have secondary associations. For example, this phrase here, tachyon resonance. It's a reference to experimental work on temporal field stabilization and chronal stabilization protocols that's linked to a research contract with a defense lab in Maryland. But the really strange part, these same phrases appear in a Vatican archive index from the 50s. Whoever was behind this, they were coordinating with civilian and religious institutions." He paused, then added, "You should be careful, you're not the only one looking at this." I didn't ask him to explain. I already knew. After I hung up, I copied every note and stored the originals in a safe deposit box. The feeling of dread was becoming a constant. It followed me through every part of my day, standing in line for coffee, driving home at night, staring at the computer screen until my vision blurred. On a cold Tuesday morning, an anonymous tip landed in my voicemail. The voice was strained, trembling. She blinked out, then blinked back. "I swear it. You need to look at the medical logs, Naval Hospital, Bethesda, 44. There was a pause, a ragged breath. "Be careful. They watch the shipping lanes." The message ended there. That was when I started to feel a line was being crossed. Just by me, but by whoever was tracking my work. I didn't tell anyone about the call, not even Raphael. Instead, I booked a train to Washington under a different name, using a prepaid card to pay for the ticket. I spent the trip with my coat, collar pulled up, staring out the window at the grey blur of the mid. The closer I got to the capital, the more certain I became that I was chasing something that didn't want to be found. In the reading room of the National Archives, I requested the Naval Hospital transfer logs from 1944. The clerk didn't blink, just handed me a stack of brittle pages. It took hours of cross-referencing crew rosters to find my grandfather's record. There it was. Thomas H. Kin chronic disorientation, visual hallucinations, unexplained dermal lesions. The admission notes were almost as disturbing as the diagnosis. Subject exhibits conviction he has witnessed future events. Memory loops. Persistent. Recommends observation under Code Black protocol. I closed the file and sat back, trying to process the fact that my grandfather might have been one of the first test subjects in an experiment no one was ever supposed to admit existed. Photocopied everything. Before I left, I checked the sign-in logs and saw a line that made my skin go cold. Someone else had pulled the same file 2 days earlier. The signature was illegible, but the notation said dire oversight. That night, I met Raphael at a bar near DuPont Circle. He was already 2 drinks in, his glasses fogged from the steam rising off the whiskey. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said when I sat down. "Close," I replied. I slid the copies across the table. He read silently, his expression growing darker with each line. "You realize what this means?" he asked. "That the Eldridge was just the beginning," I said. He nodded slowly. "And that someone has been cleaning up the evidence for 70 years. I didn't sleep much when I got back to my hotel. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my grandfather's face blank, staring, like those sailors in the old stories who came back wrong. The next morning, I logged into a handful of conspiracy forums I'd been monitoring for months. Most of the chatter was nonsense alien implants. Hollow Earth theories, but buried among the rants were posts that lined up too neatly to dismiss. A user called Temporal Witness had been posting since 2003, claiming to have seen military transports moving unmarked crates out of Montauk late at night. Another claimed their uncle had worked on a project called Project Pegasus and had been paid in cash to keep silent. One thread included a scan of a faded memo, successful insertion achieved at T+9 hours. The same phrase Raphael had flagged in, the CIPHERS. It was almost too much to absorb. That night, as I was packing my things to check out, I noticed the envelope under my door. No markings, no postage. Inside was a single piece of paper with a typed message. Stop digging or become lost in time. I read it 3 times, my hands starting to shake. When I finally looked up, I realized how quiet the hotel floor had become. No footsteps in the hall, no voices drifting under the doors, just the dull thud of my own heartbeat. I stayed awake until dawn. The note propped on the desk beside me like a warning I couldn't ignore. The sun rose behind the city skyline, washing the buildings in pale orange light. I watched it happen and thought about everything I'd learned in the past week. The ship that vanished, the men who came back fractured, the agencies that would rather erase the past than admit what they'd done, and somewhere in the middle of all that was my grandfather. Whatever happened next, I knew I was committed. The only way out was through. I was already half convinced. I was being followed by the time I left Washington. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, there was the same blue sedan, never too close, never too far. I tried to tell myself it was just paranoia, the residue of too many nights with too little sleep. But when I turned off onto a state highway to throw off any tail, the sedan followed me through 2 exits before disappearing behind a line of trucks. After that, I knew I couldn't go home. Not yet. Instead, I headed north, up the I-95 corridor until I crossed into New York. The road signs glowed in my headlights, promising things I didn't believe in anymore. Safety, certainty, the idea that the world stayed in place when you weren't. Looking at it, I kept driving until the city skyline gave way to the low sprawl of suburban lights. I stopped at a 24-hour diner in Yonkers and spent an hour with my laptop propped against the salt shaker, trying to decide what to do next. The note they'd slipped under my door was still in my jacket pocket. Every time I thought about it, I felt a chill creep up my spine, somewhere between the 3rd cup of coffee and the start of dawn. I made a decision I knew I couldn't walk back. If the Vatican really had been involved in the early chronal experiments, then the only place to confirm it was Rome. I booked a one-way flight on an airline I'd never used before, paid in cash, and walked out into the cold morning air, feeling like I'd finally crossed some invisible line. 3 days later, I was in a back room of the Vatican's secret archives, sitting across from a cleric who refused to give me his full name. He called himself Father Luca. He was thin and sallow-eyed, the sort of man who looked like he'd been born in a library and never left. His English was flawless, but every word felt carefully measured, like he was afraid something dangerous would slip out if he wasn't precise. "You understand," he said. "This conversation does not exist." I nodded, double quotes, "and if you record me, I will end it." "I'm not recording," I said. He studied me for a moment, then pushed a thin folder across the table. The cover was stamped with an insignia I didn't recognize, a crucifix encircled by geometric lines that reminded me of the diagrams in the Navy reports. These documents were never intended for public scrutiny, he said. They were part of an internal inquiry into the work of Father Pellegrino Ernetti. I'd read the name before. Ernetti was the Benedictine monk who'd claimed to have built a device capable of seeing through time, a so-called chronovisor. Most historians dismissed it as a fable, a curiosity of Cold War esoterica. But the folder in front of me felt anything but imaginary. I opened it slowly, half expecting the pages to vanish when I blinked. The first document was a schematic hand-drawn, with notations in Latin and Italian. The main diagram showed a series of curved plates surrounding what looked like a cathode ray tube. Lines radiated from the assembly, annotated with symbols I couldn't decipher. "It's real," I said. Before I could stop myself, Father Luca didn't answer. The next few pages were technical descriptions, references to electromagnetic optics, resonance frequencies, something called temporal harmonics. But it was the final section that made my throat tighten. It was a memorandum dated July 1953. The author's name was blacked out, but the subject line was intact. Proposal for joint development, Vatican Engineering and Dyer Research Division. I looked up. "This can't be what it looks like." "It is," Luca said quietly. "In the early 50s, certain individuals in your government approached the church with an offer. They believed Father Ernetti's device could be adapted for intelligence, gathering confirming historical narratives, verifying treaties, perhaps even locating hidden assets. The Vatican had other priorities, religious ones, I guessed. Religious, yes, also political. Imagine the implications if the church could demonstrate authentic visual records of the crucifixion or the Council of Nicaea. I felt a heaviness in my chest. Did it work? He hesitated. According to these accounts, it functioned intermittently, but enough to convince both parties it was worth pursuing. I turned another page and found a grainy photograph, clipped to the margin. It showed a group of men in lab coats standing around a metal framework shaped like a dome. A large screen was mounted in the center, the image on it blurred beyond recognition. Beneath it was a caption, "Test, Drome, 44 BCE. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I thought of my grandfather, sitting alone in that naval hospital, insisting. He'd seen the future. I thought of the Navy's test logs, the strange disappearances, the hints that the Eldridge hadn't just shifted in space but in time. And now here was the same principle, refracted through the lens of religious ambition. You're certain these are authentic?" I asked. "As certain as one can be," he said. "These records were sealed by papal decree. Very few have ever seen them." I sat back and rubbed my eyes. My pulse was thudding so hard I could feel it in my temples. Luca leaned forward. "What will you do with this information?" "Tell the truth," I said. He sighed, as if he'd expected that answer all along. "Understand that disclosure may do more harm than good. There are reasons these things were hidden." "I'm sure there are," I said. "But that doesn't mean they should stay that way." He closed the folder and tapped it once with his fingertips. "I can give you copies, but you must never mention my name." "I won't," I promised. It was late afternoon when I left the archives, the Roman sky bruised with rain clouds. I walked past St. Peter's Square, feeling like I'd stepped into some alternate reality where every myth I'd ever discounted was turning out to be true. Back in my hotel room, I spread the documents across the bed, the chronovisor diagrams, the testimony of Ernetti describing moving pictures of the past, the memo proposing a partnership with American intelligence. I couldn't shake the feeling that the project hadn't ended, that somewhere, in some sealed bunker, the technology was still evolving. I thought again about the note they'd left under my door in DC. Stop digging or become lost in time. I was starting to believe it wasn't just a metaphor. Just before midnight, I powered up my laptop and began drafting the outline of the article I'd spent years circling around. For the first time, it felt like more than speculation. I had names, dates, evidence, and still a voice in the back of my mind kept whispering that it wouldn't be enough, that someone, somewhere, would find a way to discredit it all. I closed the computer and looked at my reflection in the window, the city lights flickering behind me. I thought of my grandfather again, his hollow eyes, the way he'd spoken about things no one believed. I understood him now in a way I never had before. This wasn't just about proving a story. It was about finishing the promise I'd made to him on that porch all those years ago. I pressed my palm against the cold glass and let myself feel, just for a moment, the fear I'd been trying to ignore. Because if the past wasn't fixed, then none of us was safe, and I was running out of places to hide. I left Rome with a folder full of evidence, and the creeping certainty that every step forward was taking me closer to something I wasn't prepared to face. The flight home felt endless, the hours marked by the soft drone of the engines and the ache behind my eyes. Every time I closed them, I saw that grainy photograph of the chronovisor, the vague outlines of a past moment frozen on the screen. I thought it might be enough that the Vatican documents would finally tie everything together. But as soon as I landed, a new lead found me before I even reached my front door. The message was waiting on my encrypted email. No greeting, no signature, just a sentence that made my chest tighten. If you want the rest of the story, go to Camp Hero Montauk. Holds the keys. I didn't reply. I just sat there in the cab with my laptop balanced on my knees, watching the city roll past, thinking about every rumor I'd ever heard about Montauk Air Force Station. They called it a lot of things over the years. A radar station, a Cold War outpost, a research facility. But to the people who made a hobby of chasing conspiracies, it was something much stranger, a place where reality had been stretched thin enough to tear Dot by the next morning. I'd arranged a rental car and made the drive out to Long Island. The farther east I went, the more the landscape emptied itself out. Strip malls gave way to pine woods and salt marshes. By the time I pulled onto the cracked access road leading to the old base, there was nothing around but sand, scrub grass, and the rusted skeletons of long-abandoned watchtowers. I left the car near the perimeter fence and climbed through a gap in the chain link. The wind off the ocean was cold enough to sting, carrying the faint tang of salt and decay. The buildings ahead were crumbling under the weight of time and neglect. Windows shattered, roofs sagging, but there was something deliberate in the way. The place had been left to rot, as if someone wanted to erase any memory of what had happened there. I walked slowly, my footsteps crunching over broken glass and dead leaves. Every so often, I stopped to listen, half expecting to hear voices, echoing from the shadows. But the only sounds were the wind and the distant boom of waves breaking on the shore. I found the first clue in what had once been an administrative office. The desk drawers were long since emptied, but in a false panel behind one cabinet, I felt the edge of something that didn't belong. When I pried it loose, a battered leather-bound journal slid out, its cover stiff with mildew. The name on the first page was written, in a shaky hand, pressed in nickels. I flipped through the entries, carefully. Each was dated, each a blend of technical jargon and raw unease. June 4th, 1981. Preliminary tests with the psi. Amplifier show variable results. Subjects report auditory hallucinations. Some see corridors of blue light. I question the ethics of this work. July 17th. The Stargate rig achieved momentary stabilization. Recorded a displacement event of 0.13 seconds. No visual confirmation. The feeling among the team is a mix of awe and dread. August 2. Trainee number 12 entered the field and did not return for 3 minutes. When he emerged, he was incoherent. Later, sedated, repeated the phrase "it's still there" until he lost consciousness. I had to stop reading for a moment. My hands were trembling. I slipped the journal into my bag and continued deeper into the building. The main laboratory was cavernous, with rusted conduits coiling along the walls like veins. In the center stood a circular dais of concrete, scorched black in places. Series of thick cables still snaked away into a control console bolted to the far wall. On the floor beside the console, someone had scratched a series of dates into the concrete. They were spread out over nearly a decade. Some were familiar years when the rumors about Montauk had reached fever pitch. I crouched there, tracing the marks with my fingertip, feeling the unsettling certainty that whatever had happened here wasn't as buried as it looked. I moved carefully through the adjoining rooms, taking photographs of anything that looked like evidence. In a side corridor, I found a cracked monitor lying face down. When I lifted it, I saw a sticker on the back that made my breath catch. Property of Defense Intelligence Agency. It was confirmation I hadn't dared hope for in a storage closet nearby. I found more journals, moldy, half eligible, but in the bottom of an old footlocker, wrapped in plastic sheeting, was something that made every hair on my neck stand up. A videotape in an unmarked case. I turned it over in my hands, wondering what could possibly be on it that someone had taken the trouble to hide it for decades. I left Camp Hero at dusk, the sky streaked purple and gold over the empty towers. Back in the rental car, I locked the doors and sat there with the tape on my lap. For the first time since this began, I wondered if I was ready to see whatever it contained. Back at a cheap motel near Riverhead, I borrowed a VCR from the front desk, some leftover relic they kept for guests who insisted on watching old movies. I threaded the tape in and hit play, bracing myself. The video was grainy, black and white. At first, it was nothing but static and the murmur of a low-frequency hum. Then, the camera shifted to a cavernous rumor, different lab from the one I'd just left. In the center stood the same circular dais I'd seen hours earlier. A man in a silver bodysuit walked into the frame, his movements stiff, almost mechanical. For a moment, he just stood there, staring straight ahead. Then, a flare of light erupted behind him, brilliant and unnatural, casting warped shadows across the walls. I watched in stunned silence as the man stepped forward into the bloom of light and vanished, not behind a curtain or into darkness. He simply dissolved, like a figure cut from a film reel. There was no sound but the hum, and then the video ended. I replayed it 3 times, hoping to catch some trick of editing, some glitch that could explain what I'd seen. But every time, the sequence was identical. When I shut off the machine, the silence was deafening. I thought of all the pieces I'd collected so far, novel experiments. The chronovisor, the Vatican collaboration, and now this. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. The experiments hadn't stopped with the Eldritch. They'd evolved, metastasized, hidden themselves under layers of bureaucracy and folklore, and I was the only one who seemed determined to drag it into the light. Sometime after midnight, I packed everything into my bag and stood by the window, looking out at the empty parking lot. In the corner of the lot, I saw headlights flare to life. A car I didn't recognize pulled out slowly, headlights darkening again as it merged onto the road. I didn't need proof to know they'd been watching me all along. I told myself it didn't matter, but as I lay awake, the images from the tape kept replaying behind my eyelids. The man in the silver suit, the impossible light, and the unshakable sense that whatever I was chasing, it was already waiting for me to catch up. By the time I left Long Island, I knew there was no chance I'd ever look at the world the same way again. The videotape had burned itself into my mind, the man stepping into that flare of light and simply ceasing to exist. No cut, no trick, just an empty platform. I drove all night, not trusting myself to stop anywhere for long. Every gas station felt like a place someone might be waiting. Every diner looked like a trap. I made it back to the city just before dawn, exhausted but wired with adrenaline, in my office. I spread out everything I'd gathered so far: the Vatican schematics, the Montauk journals, the photos of the Eldritch, tried to see the shape of it. A network, not just American, not just military, a coalition of interests spanning decades. And yet there was still a gap I couldn't fill. The same morning, I got an email from Raphael. No subject line, no pleasantries, just a single sentence: "You need to look into Lab X." I had never heard of it. A few discreet calls to contacts in Europe turned up nothing. But an old journalist I trusted in Berlin suggested a name: Viktor Sokolov, a Soviet physicist who'd vanished sometime in the early 80s. He'd published exactly one known paper, a dry treatise on low-frequency resonance fields, before he disappeared. I sat in the dark, staring at his grainy-eyed photo on my laptop screen. A man with hollow eyes and the kind of blank expression that made me think he'd seen too much and given up trying to forget. It took days of encrypted messages and favors to secure a meeting with someone who claimed to have worked with Her name was Irina Petrovna. She was living under a different identity somewhere near the Mongolian border, hiding from both her past and the people who might want to silence it. The conversation happened over a secure video call routed through more relays than I could count. Even then, her face was hidden in shadow, her voice distorted. But what she told me erased any last illusions I had about the scale of this thing. "They called it Lab X," she began, her tone flat and almost bored, as if she'd told the story too many times to care anymore. "It was outside Moscow, officially. It did materials research. In reality, we were tasked with something far less practical. Temporal experiments," I said quietly. She hesitated just long enough to let me know I'd guessed correctly. "Yes, but not just time. Consciousness. They believed if you could subject the mind to extreme low-frequency fields, you could trigger visions, previews, a glimpse into alternate timelines." I tried to imagine it. Soviet technicians crowded around primitive monitors, watching soldiers hallucinate centuries in a dark bunker. "Did it work?" I asked. "In a way," she replied. "Some subjects reported vivid experiences. One man claimed he saw a future war in the Middle East. Another described a city in flames, what he called a new Moscow. But the price was high. Her voice cracked a little. Hi, how? Some never woke up. Others never came back fully. They'd walk the halls, muttering in languages no one recognized. Some would seize and stop breathing. The worst cases would vanish. Irina fell, silent. You mean disappear physically? I pressed. I mean exactly that, she said. In one trial, a technician named Mikhail was exposed to the generator for less than 5 minutes. When the current peaked, he began to scream. His body rippled like water. Then he was gone. No remains. Nothing. I swallowed hard. Why? Haven't you told this to more people? Because, she whispered, no one wants to believe it. And those who do never stay free for long. Her image flickered. I realized she was about to end the call. Wait, I said. Was there any documentation? Yes, she said. But it was smuggled out, piecemeal, over years. What survived ended up in an FTP archive run by dissidents. Try the name Perimeter Archive. You'll need to search for code-K-24. Then the connection went dead. I sat there for a long time, staring at my own reflection in the black screen. When I finally moved, it was to grab my second laptop, the one I kept completely offline. I connected it only long enough to find the Perimeter Archive and start a download. The files were slow to transfer, but eventually a folder appeared, dense with PDFs and scans. I opened the first one, K24, Chrono-Perceptual Protocols. The document was a mix of typed Russian and annotations in English. It detailed the construction of a psi generator, an array of copper coils wrapped around a metal chair, with a thick cable running to a transformer the size of a small car. A test log described the effect on subjects: elevated cortisol, auditory hallucinations, partial paralysis, and in some cases, physical displacement. Another file was a transcript of an interview with a defector, someone who claimed to have witnessed a man flicker in and out of view before disappearing altogether. The pattern was becoming too clear. In America, they'd tried to move ships. In Russia, they'd tried to move minds. Neither had succeeded without destroying people in the process. I spent the next hours cross-referencing every date and location. What I found made my scalp prickle. Montauk's tests had peaked in the mid-1980s. So had Lab X in the files. There were references to something called synchronization protocols, coordinated events across continents. It read like science fiction, except I had a dozen photos and witness statements to prove it wasn't. And then there was the most damning piece, a partial translation of a Soviet directive authorizing joint observation of SOGEN and M resonance trials by American and Soviet observers, a Cold War collaboration. I leaned back and exhaled, my chest tight. So many years we'd been told the arms race was about nuclear weapons, but all along something deeper had been running beneath Etan, invisible war for control of time itself. I called Raphael again. When he answered, I didn't bother with small talk. They were working together, I said. I know, he replied. I found similar references in the Vatican logs. You understand what this means, right? That none of us were ever told the truth, I said. And that if you keep going, you'll be next on the list to disappear. He hung up before I could reply. I sat there, the files open in front of me, the screen casting pale light across the cluttered desk. Somewhere, someone was trying very hard to keep this buried, and I was just stubborn or stupid enough to keep digging. That night, I made 3 backup copies of the data and mailed them to contacts I trusted. It was insurance. Then, I pulled out a fresh notepad and began sketching the outline of what I'd learned. Philadelphia, the origin. Montauk, the refinement. Lab X, the mirror image. The Vatican, the secret custodian. All tied together by the same principle, a belief that time was not a river, but a weapon. By the time I finished, dawn was breaking again. I had no illusions that this was the end of it. If anything, it felt like the beginning. After the revelations about Lab X, I tried to tell myself it was time to stop, that I had enough evidence to write the story and be done with it. But the truth was, I wasn't anywhere close to finished. The Soviets had reached for the same dark science the Americans had chased. They'd just wrapped it in different language, side generators instead of chronal fields, perceptual dislocation instead of time travel. But it was the same pursuit, control over something no one should ever have tried to own. In the quiet hours before dawn, when I couldn't sleep, I'd catch myself thinking about the man on the Montauk videotape, about Sokolov's missing technicians, about my grandfather sitting alone in that naval hospital, talking about events no living man could have witnessed. That was the moment when I started looking into John T. Itor. I knew the name the same way most people did. A piece of internet folklore from the early 2000s, an alleged time traveler who'd appeared on message boards, posting elaborate prophecies and technical blueprints. The mainstream consensus was that Titor had been a prank or an early viral marketing stunt. But as I dug deeper, I realized there were parts of the story that had never been explained away so neatly. For 3 nights, I barely left my office. I scoured every archived post, every discussion thread, every preserved chat log. What I found was a mixture of the surreal and the mundane. Detailed predictions of civil unrest in America, instructions for operating an IBM 5100 computer, vague warnings about a nuclear conflict. But one post in particular stopped me cold. It was dated December 2000, 6 months before the Montauk tape I'd uncovered was allegedly recorded. In it, Titor described a facility on Long Island where experiments were conducted using high-energy electromagnetic fields to open windows. He even named the location Camp Hero. At first, I thought it had to be a hoax, someone retrofitting their claims to match old conspiracy theories. But the post had been time-stamped and archived in real time. The reference predated any widespread discussion of Montauk's supposed Stargate by years. It felt like another puzzle piece, a thread leading somewhere I wasn't sure I wanted to go. I reached out to Dr. Lena Morales, a cyber historian I'd interviewed once for an unrelated story. She specialized in digital ephemeral websites, lost forums, forgotten Usenet groups. If anyone could authenticate the posts, it was her. We met in a small cafe tucked behind a laundromat in Brooklyn, the kind of place where the music was too loud and the tables too close together. She wore her hair pulled back, a tablet propped in front of her like a shield. Most of Titor's claims are easily debunked, she said as she scrolled through the files I'd given her. His timelines are inconsistent. His predictions about the Olympics, the civil war, none of it matches the record. I know, I said. But what about this? I leaned across the table and tapped the Camp Hero reference. Lena frowned. This predates the earliest credible Montauk publications. Could he have been working from classified knowledge? Possible, she admitted. But it's equally likely this was a very clever piece of disinformation. A test to see how far an idea could spread, or an attempt to bury something real under layers of fantasy. We fell silent as the espresso machine hissed behind us. Finally, she looked up at me. "You realize there's another possibility." "What's that?" "That Titter was never an individual at all. That he was a composite identity in operation, designed to muddy the waters, to turn real research into something laughable." "A piss-up," she nodded. "It wouldn't be the first time. Look at COINTELPRO, MKUltra. The easiest way to discredit something is to surround it with nonsense." I tried to imagine the resources it would take to manufacture such a project, the careful drip of information, the plausible but unverifiable details. "Can you trace the posts?" I asked. Lena smiled faintly. "That's why you called me, isn't it?" It took her 2 days to finish the forensic analysis. When she called me back, her voice was different, quieter, as if she wasn't sure she wanted to be the person telling me what she'd found. "Most of the posts originated from an anonymizing service," she said, "but I was able to recover partial server logs. And there's something you need to see." She emailed me the metadata. I opened it on my laptop in the middle of my darkened office. There, buried in a sea of hexadecimal code, was an IP range registered to a Department of Defense server in Virginia. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. I called her immediately. "You're sure?" "Positive." The posts were routed through multiple proxies, but the origin point was the same subnet used for internal communications. I cross-referenced it twice. "So John Titter was government," I said, more to myself than to her. "Or someone with access," she said carefully. I closed the laptop, feeling something cold settle into my stomach. In a single stroke, it explained everything: the specificity, the partial truths, the reason no one had ever stepped forward to claim. Credit Titter wasn't a crank. He was a smokescreen dot over the next week. I went back over every detail of the Titter saga, his technical specifications, his references to time displacement equipment, his claims about the IBM 5100, even the predictions that hadn't come true, now seemed like part of the same design. A calculated mix of fact and fiction, engineered to discredit anyone who tried to look deeper. I spent a lot of nights in the office after that. Sometimes I'd sit there until dawn, the city slowly lighting up around me, while I tried to decide whether I was any closer to the truth or just further lost in a maze. One night, while scrolling through an old thread, I came across a comment that made my breath catch. They let you see just enough to hang yourself with your own curiosity. I read it over and over, the words burning into me. Was that what I'd been doing all along? Pulling at threads someone else had laid out, convinced I was uncovering something real when I was only following a path designed to lead me in circles. I thought again of my grandfather, of his last weeks in that hospital, of the way he'd looked at me when he said some things were better left buried, but I couldn't let it go. I opened a fresh document and began typing, organizing everything I knew about Titter, the timeline, the predictions, the references to Montauk, to time travel, to the same theories I'd been chasing for months. And as I worked, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. Even if every word he'd written was a fabrication, the fact remained that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to build that fabrication, and that meant there was something under it worth hiding. By the time the sun rose again, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to stop, because in the end, I'd rather choke on the truth than swallow the lie. I spent the better part of 2 weeks dissecting everything John Titor had ever posted. By the end, I felt like I was breathing in someone else's paranoia, like all the caution, all the circular logic had gotten under my skin. And the worst part was, I couldn't shake the sense that he, or whoever he really was, had succeeded. Every lead I chased pointed back to the same question. Why spend so much effort constructing an elaborate fiction unless it was meant to bury something real? In those nights, when the office was silent except for the hum of my hard drives, I started to trace the patterns I hadn't noticed before, the repeated references to micro-worm, the insistence that high-energy collisions could distort time in measurable ways. It was the same language I'd seen in the Montauk files, in the Soviet archives, even in the Vatican memos. So when Raphael called me one morning and said, "You should look at Geneva," I didn't bother asking what he meant. I already knew. I booked a flight that same day, paying cash for the ticket and traveling with a backpack so small it looked almost suspicious in customs. The agent at the counter gave me a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes and asked how long I'd be staying. "Just a few days," I said. It felt like a lie. By the time I arrived in Geneva, the air had the sharp clarity that only comes with early spring. Everything was bright and clean in a way that made the city feel like a facade. It didn't matter how many fresh flowers lined the cobblestones somewhere. Beneath all that civility, people were building machines designed to punch holes in reality itself. I checked into a cheap hotel across the border in France, the kind of place that rented rooms to visiting scientists and budget tourists. The walls were thin, the hallway carpet stained, but I didn't care. I hadn't come for comfort. The next day, I took a tram toward the CERN campus. From the outside, it looked almost banal. Low concrete buildings, bright blue signs, a gift shop hawking magnets and t-shirts printed with particle tracks. But underground, I knew there was a ring of machinery powerful enough to recreate conditions last seen at the birth of the universe. A friend of a friend had arranged a discreet introduction to a technician who called himself Eco Stargate. I never learned his real name. He met me in the corner of a cafeteria crowded with students. His badge hung backward on his lanyard, and he never took his sunglasses off, even indoors. "I can't talk long," he said, voice low, "but I know what you're looking for." I didn't bother pretending otherwise. "You worked on the LHC." I asked. "Still do," he said, "but only in maintenance now. They moved me off the main project after I filed a report." "What kind of report?" He hesitated. "The kind you're not supposed to write. In 2008, during the first power ramp-up, some of us saw something we couldn't explain." "Go on." He looked around the cafeteria as if searching for someone who might be listening. "Light," he said finally. "Not just an arc flash or a static discharge. A blue vortex, maybe 3 meters wide, hanging near the beam." It lasted less than a second, but the sensors went haywire. Radiation alarms triggered, but the readings didn't match anything in the protocols. "Did you document it?" "We tried," he said. "The footage was pulled from the archives. Within an hour, we were told it was an artifactor camera glitch." He leaned in closer, but it wasn't. He slipped a small USB drive across the table. "Logs, timestamps, GPS coordinates," he said. "You didn't get this from me." Before I could say anything, he stood and walked away, leaving me alone with the drive burning a hole in my palm. I took a tram back across the border, feeling my nerves unraveling one strand at a time. In my hotel room, I plugged the drive into my offline laptop and opened the files. The logs were dense, filled with engineering jargon I barely understood. But the anomalies were clear. Power fluctuations in the main superconducting magnets, unexplained temperature spikes, radiation counts that suggested something more than a routine experiment. Then there were the photographs, blurred frames of the tunnel cables and steel, ribsand in the center, a smear of blue light shaped like a funnel. It looked almost identical to the footage I'd seen from Montauk. I sat back and tried to breathe. It wasn't just an American obsession. It wasn't a Soviet one, either. It was global. Somewhere along the way, the quest to master time had become an unspoken ambition shared across nations. And if CRN's experiments really were opening windows, then maybe the conspiracy wasn't to create these events, but to hide how often they were happening. I needed someone who could help me understand the science, someone willing to explain it without dismissing it as fantasy. So I called Dr. Eliza Moran. She'd spent most of her career shooting down stories like mine, but she was also the only physicist I knew who wouldn't laugh me out of the room. We met the next morning in a cafe near the lake. She looked tired, her hair pulled back in a haphazard knot, dark circles under her eyes. "I'm only here because you sounded serious," she said without preamble. I handed her a printout of the logs and the photos. She read them in silence. "This looks real," she said finally, "but you realize what you're implying? That someone has been conducting unauthorized tests? That someone is flirting with the kind of physics we don't even fully understand?" She said. She tapped the photo of the vortex. "If you really did capture evidence of a micro wormhole, that's not just a leak in containment. That's a violation of the chronology protection conjecture." "In plain English?" I asked. She sighed. "It means they may have created a shortcut through space-time, however briefly. If that's true, it's the most dangerous experiment humanity has ever attempted." I swallowed hard. What happens if it doesn't close? Elisa didn't answer right away. "I don't know," she admitted. "No one does." She pushed the papers back, toward me. "You need to be careful. If this is real, there are people who will do anything to keep it buried." I didn't tell her that I already knew that. That night, back in my room, I stared at the photos again. The same blue light, the same distortion, if the Montauk tapes were genuine. And if CERN had reproduced the effect, then the last 70 years of rumors weren't fiction at all. They were breadcrumbs. I thought of my grandfather, the Eldridge, the men who never came back the same. And I wondered if, somewhere in all this, the timeline itself was unraveling. In the morning, I packed my things and caught the first train out of Geneva, because if they were willing to manipulate the past, I didn't want to be around when they decided to rewrite the present. I told myself I was leaving Geneva to get distance, but the truth was simpler. I was running out of places to go that didn't feel compromised. I spent a few nights drifting between cheap hotels in Milan, trying to decide what to do next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same blue vortex flickering behind my eyelids, proof that whatever Montauk had tried to start, CERN had come, dangerously close to finishing. But the thread that kept tugging at me was older than particle physics. I couldn't stop thinking about the chronovisor. The Vatican diagrams hadn't left my mind since the day I first held them. Part of me still believed that if there was any single artifact that could make sense of everything, the Eldridge, the Montauk experiments, the Soviet side generators, it was that battered device. On my 4th night in Italy, I called the number Father Luca had given me months earlier. It rang 5 times before he picked up, his voice low and wary. "I hoped you'd burned that number," he said. "So did I." There was a silence that stretched too long to be comfortable. "What do you want now?" "I want to see it." He didn't pretend to misunderstand. "You're asking for something that could destroy both of us." "Then destroy me," I said. "But if you ever believed your church had a responsibility to truth, this is the moment." More silence. "Be at the East Service Gate tomorrow night," he said finally. 1 o'clock. Come alone. The line went dead. I barely slept. My mind cycled through every possible scenario: arrest, disappearance, something worse. But when the night came, I walked to the Vatican perimeter with the same numb inevitability that had carried me to Montauk. The service gate looked unremarkable, just a stretch of reinforced steel tucked behind a delivery dock. Luca emerged from the shadows without a word, dressed in a simple black coat. He looked older than I remembered. "Follow me," he murmured. We moved through a warren of back corridors that smelled of old stone and polish. No guards, no cameras I could see. It struck me that the most powerful institution on earth could still hide anything it wanted, simply by pretending it wasn't there. At last, Lucas stopped before a tall wooden door banded in iron. He unlocked it with a small brass key, then pressed his palm to a recessed panel I wouldn't have noticed if he hadn't moved. A faint chime sounded, and the door clicked open. The chamber beyond was smaller than I expected, maybe the size of a chapel vestry. It was lined with shelves crowded with ancient boxes and metal cases stamped in Latin, but in the center, draped in a canvas cloth, stood the thing I'd traveled halfway around the world to see. Luca crossed the floor and lifted the cover. I hadn't known what to expect. Some polished, futuristic machine. Instead, the chronovisor looked almost primitive-like, an old television married to a science project. Its base was a battered metal cabinet, the casing pitted with corrosion. A bank of glass vacuum tubes jutted from the rear-like vertebrae. Wires snaked into a round screen, maybe a foot across, cracked in 2 places. "This is it," Luca said quietly. I stepped closer. Even broken, it radiated a sense of purpose that made the air feel heavier. "It still works?" I asked. "In theory," he said, "but it hasn't been powered in decades." He rested a hand on the casing, as if steadying himself. "You have to understand," he continued. "The device never produced perfect images. The past came in fragments, blurred, inconsistent. It was like tuning a radio to a station you could never quite lock onto. Why abandon it?" He looked up at me, and for the first time I saw something like grief in his eyes. "Because it showed us things no one was prepared to see," he said. "Not just the miracles we hoped to verify. It showed atrocities, executions, 1,000, moments of cruelty and loss, and we realized we were tampering with something sacred." I thought about that for a long moment. "Or you realized you could never control it," I said. He didn't argue. He reached behind the cabinet and flicked a switch. The chronovisor let out a soft hum, followed by a series of mechanical clicks. One by one, the vacuum tubes glowed amber. Luca pressed a sequence of buttons, then turned a dial. The cracked screen flickered to life. For a moment, it showed only static. Then, shapes began to coalesce, dark figures moving in an indistinct haze. I held my breath. "What are we seeing?" I asked. Luca swallowed. His hand trembled on the dial. "Jerusalem," he whispered. 33 AD. The image sharpened just enough to make out the outline of a hill. A cross stood at its crest, silhouetted against a flat grey sky. Even with the distortion, I could tell the scene was real in a way no recording could ever fake. Luca turned the dial again, and the picture dissolved into a whirl of darkness. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then, without warning, the screen snapped to a new image. This time, the date etched at the bottom made my heart skip. October 28th, 1943. The deck of a ship materialized in grainy monochrome. Men in navy uniforms stumbled across the frame, their movements jerky, impossible. One turned to look straight at the camera war, whatever passed for a cameraman. I felt something tighten behind my ribs. It was my grandfather, younger, whole, and terrified. Then the image blurred. A ring of light expanded behind him, and the screen went black. I staggered back, blinking away tears I hadn't felt coming. Luca shut off the machine and let the darkness return. "You understand now," he said softly, "why we sealed it away." I couldn't speak. He covered the chronovisor again, his movements slow. "There is a record of every moment," he said. "Every cruelty, every lie. But knowing doesn't mean we are strong enough to bear it." I thought about that all the way back to my hotel. It was almost dawn when I sat on the edge of the bed, the sky outside paling by degrees. The chronovisor hadn't just confirmed my suspicions, it had left me with a choice. I could write everything, expose it all, but the cost wouldn't just be mine. Once the world saw proof that time could be observed, or worse, manipulated, no institution would ever be safe again. And yet, as I replayed that last image, my grandfather staring into the knew I'd already decided I was going to finish what he started, because if the past was a weapon, the only defense was to drag it into the light, no matter who tried to stop me. In the days after I saw the chronovisor, the edges of my reality felt thinner, as if I'd accidentally stepped into a place where the past and present leaked into each other. Some nights, I'd wake in the dark, convinced I was still in that Vatican chamber, watching my grandfather dissolve into the vortex. Other times, I'd look at the simplest things: a cup on my desk, a plane crossing the sky, and feel a deep unease, as though nothing was fixed anymore. But I also felt something else: certainty. For the first time since I'd started this search, there was no part of me that wondered if it was all in my head. That clarity drove me to the next lead, one I'd been avoiding because it sounded too outlandish even compared to Montauk or the Eldridge. Andrew Basiago. His name had surfaced over and over in the stranger corners of my research. A lawyer who claimed he'd been part of Project Pegasasa, supposed Defense Advanced Research Projects agency initiative that trained children to travel through time and space. If I'd read about him 6 months earlier, I would have dismissed every word. But the Vatican footage had taught me the difference between disbelief and denial. So when Basiago agreed to meet, I boarded a flight to Seattle with the same resigned determination that had carried me across the Atlantic. I'd stopped trying to convince myself I could walk away. We met in a diner near Puget Sound. He was already seated when I arrived, wearing a grey suit that looked slightly too big for him, as if he'd borrowed it for the occasion. His face was broad and earnest, but his eyes had the cautious look of someone who'd learned not to expect understanding. "You're the reporter," he said, as I slid into the booth. "Some days," I replied. He cracked a tired smile. "Then, let's get this over with." I pulled out my recorder and set it between us. "You can turn that on," he said. "I've told this story too many times to be precious about it." So I pressed record. Basiago leaned back, and folded his hands. On the table, they recruited me in 1968, he began. I was 6. My father was an engineer working for Parsons. One day, he brought me to a facility in East Hanover, New Jersey. There was a group of us children. They told us we were being trained to acclimate to something called a interface. He paused to let that sink in. They said it was a form of reconnaissance. We'd be helping America prepare for future threats. I tried to keep my voice even. What did they show you? He looked past me, as if seeing it. All again, first images. They said they were projections of the past Lincoln at Gettysburg, the signing of the Declaration. But eventually, they moved us to a platform. It looked like a dentist's chair ringed with metal hoops. When they powered it up, there was a vibration, a sound that felt like it came from inside your bones. He rubbed his temple absently. The first jump was only a few minutes. I landed in a field somewhere, air thick with smoke. When I turned, I saw the platform flickering behind me, as if it was there and not there at the same time. He stopped talking and looked at me with an expression I didn't know how to name. That's when I knew I was really there, he said quietly. I studied his face. People will say this sounds insane. I told him, of course, he said without resentment. That's the point. They knew if any of us ever talked, it would sound like science fiction. But there are records, financial ones, and there are scars. He loosened his tie and unbuttoned his collar. On the side of his neck, just under the jawline, was a patch of skin the color of old parchment. I came back from the 4th jump with radiation burns, he said. They told me it was an equipment malfunction. Do you have medical documentation? I asked. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Inside were photocopies of hospital intake forms from the early 70s. They described burns of unknown origin, localized cognitive disruption, and a treatment regimen I recognized from my research: high-dose steroids. Same as the men brought back from Montauk. I kept my hands flat on the table so he wouldn't see them shake. What else did they have you do? I asked. He hesitated, then exhaled slowly. They had us memorize landmarks. They said someday we might need to report back from future events. One session, they showed me a city in ruins. Skyscrapers collapsed. A river clogged with debris. I was told that was Washington, D.C., 30 years from now. Did you believe them? He looked me dead in the eye. I still don't know what I believe, he said. But I remember how it felt. The air was wrong. Heavy, like it didn't want me there. I didn't know what to say to that. Instead, I asked about the funding. Basiago flipped to the back of the folder and pulled out a photocopy of an invoice. Parsons billed the Department of Defense for something called Temporal Field Trial Pegasus, Phase 2, paid in 1972. The amount was in the millions. It took everything. I had to keep my voice steady. You realize most people will never accept this, I said. Of course, he said, but you saw the chronovisor. You've been to Montauk. This isn't folklore. It's the same program, evolving. He leaned forward. They perfected it on us, he said. Then they moved it to places with better funding and fewer questions. Shut off the recorder. We sat in silence. The rain tapping against the windows, finally. He stood and slipped his briefcase over his shoulder. I don't expect you to save me, he said. But someone needs to tell the story. I will, I said. He gave me a long, searching look, then left without another word. I sat there until my coffee went cold. When I finally stepped outside, the city was a grey blur. Back in my hotel room, I spread out everything he'd given me. Medical records, invoices. It all felt impossibly heavy, like evidence that carried its own gravity. Before bed, I pulled out my notebook and wrote one sentence. The truth doesn't care if it sounds impossible. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't alone in this. After my conversation with Basiago, I thought I'd reached the limits of what could surprise me. But in this work, arrogance is always the prelude to another revelation. I spent 3 days in Seattle going over his files, cross-checking every line of text, every date, every name. It was exhausting, but it also felt necessary, like I was bracing myself for whatever waited in the next folder, the next phone call, the next grainy photograph. On my last night in the city, I got a message from Raphael. It was short, just an attachment and a note that said, "I don't know how long. This will stay online. Download everything." I clicked the link and felt my breath catch. It was a zip file labeled DIA FOIA Release number 7082912. The title alone would have meant nothing to most people, but I'd seen that reference once before in a margin note buried in the Montauk journals. No description, no context, just a line of text, as if someone had been reminding themselves. Crossref 780912. If this leaks. I opened the file. Inside were hundreds of scanned pages, teletype messages, internal memos, typed reports with entire paragraphs blacked out. The first document was a summary. Defense Intelligence Agency, Coronal Field Research, Project Heist, closing parenthesis. My hands went cold. I'd seen heist in the Vatican documents, but no one had ever spelled out what it stood for. Here it was in black and white, historical. Event insertion and stabilization trials. Raphael connected a battery pack, then turned the main dial. The device let out a low hum that rose in pitch until it settled into a steady tone. The room felt suddenly smaller, as if the air had thickened. A handheld Geiger counter on the table began to tick at irregular intervals. Elisa frowned and leaned forward. "Wait on that again," she said. Raphael toggled the power, restarted the sequence. The same effect repeated. "It's consistent," he said quietly. She didn't reply right away. When she finally looked up, her expression was wary. "That's not possible," she said. "Nothing in that circuit should produce a measurable M signature." Strauss let out a brittle laugh. "And yet here we are." The Geiger counter ticked twice more, then fell silent. Raphael shut off the device. The air seemed to lighten, as if a pressure had been released. I stepped back to the podium. "This is why we're here," I said. "Not to agree, but to document. What happens when the evidence refuses to fit any narrative, scientific or otherwise?" I could see the debate starting even before I finished. One reporter raised a hand. "How do you expect anyone to believe this without peer-reviewed confirmation?" I met his gaze. "I don't," I said. "But if you dismiss it out of hand, you're making the same mistake as every agency that buried this story." The room erupted in conversations, some voices skeptical, some angry, others stunned into silence. Eliza closed her binder slowly, her face pale. "You've made your point," she said quietly. "I didn't set out to prove anything," I told her. "I just wanted the truth to be bigger than the lie." For the next hour, people came and went, some shaking my hand, others refusing to look at me. When the room was empty, I sat alone in the front row, the hum of the device still echoing. In my ears, no consensus, no clean resolution, but for the first time, I didn't feel like the only person carrying the weight of what I'd found, and maybe that was the best I could hope for. I thought the symposium would buy me a buffer of public attention to keep the worst threats at bay. For a while, it almost worked. The story spread farther than I ever expected, picked up by smaller news outlets and online archives. For the first time in months, I let myself think maybe this was going to end with the truth in the open instead of buried under another layer of redactions. But optimism was a luxury I'd forgotten how to afford. 2 days after the demonstration, I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand. It was Maya Chen. I hadn't heard from her since she slipped me that flash drive in the archives. Her voice sounded different, tight, like she'd been rehearsing something she didn't want to say. "You need to come to the records office," she told me. Now, I dressed in the same clothes I'd been wearing the day before and took a cab across town. The ride felt endless. My stomach was a hollow knot. When I walked into the archive lobby, Maya was waiting by the elevator, her expression flat. "What's going on?" I asked. She didn't answer. She just gestured for me to follow. We rode down to the sublevel in silence. The door to the secure reading room was propped open, something I'd never seen before. Inside, the shelves were bare. The drawers that had held decades of ship logs, project memos, and correspondence all empty. I turned in a slow circle. "What happened?" Her eyes glistened with something she was trying not to let fall. "They came last night," she whispered. "2 men in suits, federal credentials. They said it was a reclassification under national security provisions. They took everything, everything." She nodded. "You didn't call me sooner?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. Her face crumpled then, and she sat down heavily in a chair. "I tried," she said. "But they knew about me, about my family. They had photos, my daughter's school, my parents' house. They told me if I didn't help, they'd find a way to make it look like I'd stolen classified material." My anger drained away as fast as it had come. I sank into the chair across from her. "Maya," I said, "I don't blame you." She shook her head. "You should. I gave them your files, the originals, the recordings. I thought maybe if I cooperated." I covered her hand with mine. "You did what you had to do," I said. But inside, I was reeling. Months of work on, not just my research, but evidence I'd promised to protect. "I'm leaving town," she said quietly. "They gave me 72 hours to disappear before they came back." "Where will you go?" She managed a weak smile. "Somewhere they don't care about old archives." We sat there in the half-lit room until it became clear there was nothing left to say. When she stood to leave, I hugged her, feeling her ribs through her thin cardigan. When the elevator doors closed behind her, I felt like a door in my own life had shut with them. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove out of the city, not caring where I ended up. I pulled over at a truck stop somewhere past midnight. The sky was a smear of stars, and the parking lot was half full of semis idling in the darkness. I leaned back in the driver's seat, trying to remember why I'd started any of this. That was when I saw an envelope tucked under the windshield. Wiper. I climbed out and peeled it free, my hands numb with dread. Inside was a single postcard, yellowed at the edges. The picture faded almost to nothing. It showed the USS Eldridge in harbor. On the back was a line of handwriting I knew as well as my own Thomas H. Keane. 1943. And underneath, I'm okay. Keep looking. For a long moment, all I could do was stare. My grandfather had been dead for decades, but the ink looked fresh, the strokes clear and confident. I turned the card over and over. I thought of the chronovisor, the way the past had flickered into the present. I thought of the blue vortexes, the men who walked into them and never came back the same. Somewhere in all the chaos, my grandfather had left this for me, or someone wanted me to believe he had. Either way, it felt like a door I couldn't close. I sat there until the sun started to rise. The card clutched tight in my hand. In that pale dawn, I finally understood the price of what I'd been doing. You can chase the truth as long as you want, but eventually, it stops being an idea and becomes something you live with, something you bleed for. And sometimes, you have to choose between the story and the people who trusted you to tell it. I drove back to the city, the postcard propped on the dashboard where I couldn't look away from it. When I walked into my apartment, I found the place had been tossed drawers yanked open, files scattered, a dull ache of violation in every overturned cushion. I stepped over the mess and sat at my desk. I picked up my recorder, switched it on. "My name is Thomas Keane," I said, my voice steady. "And if you're hearing this, you know that nothing I'm about to say is a theory. It's a record, and records are hard to kill." I told the story again, from the beginning. Every name, every date, every place, it took hours. By the time I finished, my throat was raw. I saved the file to 3 drives and hid them in places no one would think to look. I didn't expect it to save me, but I needed to believe that, somewhere, someone would find them and keep going. When it was done, I sat in the quiet, the postcard still on the desk. I thought of Maya, of Basiago, of every witness and whistleblower who'd trusted me and for the first time, I wondered if I'd done the right thing bringing them into this. But the truth is, like gravity, it doesn't care about your guilt. It just pulls you forward, and by then, I was too far gone to stop. After the break-in, I stopped pretending there was any way to separate my life from this story. Every morning, I woke up, half expecting to find another note, another threat, another reminder that I wasn't the only one tracking the puzzle's edges. By then, I understood something essential about conspiracies. They don't end when you discover them. They end when you either run out of nerve or run out of time. But I wasn't ready to walk away. 3 days later, I met with Dr. Alina Vargas. She was the last researcher I knew who hadn't turned cautious or disappeared outright. Her specialty was Navy archives specifically, the kind of ship records that were misfiled on purpose, hidden behind bland labels so that only someone who already knew what to look for could ever find them. We sat across from each other in a cramped reading room in Baltimore, the windows shuttered against the morning light. Alina was in her early 50s, with a softness to her manner that made it easy to underestimate how thorough she was. She'd agreed to help me, though I could tell it was less about believing every claim I'd made and more about a stubborn commitment to historical accuracy. She slid a thick folder across the table. "This," she said, tapping the cover, "is everything I could find on Project Heist." I opened it slowly. Inside were photocopies of logbooks, manifests, and requisition forms, all dated between October and December 1944. My eyes snagged on a header, stamped in red chronal deployment. "Exercises. Most of the files are incomplete," Alina said. But if you cross-reference the ship movements with port records, you'll see that the Eldritch wasn't the only vessel involved. There were 3 others. I flipped to a manifest, listing them by hull number. One name jumped out immediately. Timmerman. I thought that Timmerman wasn't commissioned until 45, I said. It wasn't, she replied. At least, not officially. I looked up. You're telling me they launched her early to test this technology? She gave me a sad little smile. I'm telling you that it doesn't matter what they claimed publicly, the paper trail says. Otherwise, I kept reading. A memo from a naval commander detailed unexpected results during Stage 3. The language was clinical, but the subtext was clear. Subject vessels disappeared from radar for approximately 27 minutes. Upon reappearance, several crew members required immediate medical evacuation. Witness reports inconsistent. Recommend sealing all logs under HEIST classification. I set the folder down and rubbed my temples. Jesus, I whispered. Alina folded her arms. I don't know what you're going to do with this, but you need to understand the stakes. If you publish these documents, the fallout will be enormous. These are the closest things to proof I've ever seen that the Navy tried to alter time itself. I looked at her, my chest tight. Can you help me find the rest? She hesitated, then nodded. There's one more place we can look, she said. A naval warehouse in Norfolk. A shipment from 1944 was routed there after the last HEIST test. Nobody ever signed the final disposal forms. If there's anything physical left equipment, logs, it's probably still in that crate. How do we get access? She exhaled. We don't ask. The next night, we drove south under cover of darkness, the folder locked in a metal case. Between our seats, I kept expecting headlights to appear behind us, but the roads stayed empty. Norfolk Naval Yard sprawled across the waterfront, a labyrinth of warehouses and locked gates. We parked in an unlit lot, our breath fogging in the cold air. Alina had a set of stolen credentials and a badge that looked real enough to pass in low light. We walked side by side, trying not to look like we were trespassing. Inside Warehouse 17, the air smelled of dust and cold metal. Rows of crates stretched into the shadows, stacked 20 feet high. Alina scanned the manifest taped to the wall. There, she whispered, pointing to an entry marked simply experimental chronal generator, -10 for 4. It took us nearly 20 minutes to find the right crater steel container, taller than I was, riveted shut. The stenciled letters were almost illegible with age. I reached out and rested my palm on the cold surface. This is it, I said. Alina swallowed. We don't have much time. We used a crowbar to pry open the side panel. Inside, something glimmered under a layer of canvas. I peeled it back carefully, and my breath caught. The device was about the size of a refrigerator, its surface pitted with corrosion. Copper conduits ran from a glass control unit into a dense tangle of wiring and vacuum tubes. I'd seen sketches in the Montauk journals, but nothing prepared me for the reality of it. A chronal generator. Alina took a shaky step back. This doesn't belong in a story, she whispered. It belongs in a vault. I nodded, though I couldn't stop staring. What happens if it still works? She looked at me with wide, frightened eyes. Then you have a choice, she said. Destroy it, or show the world. For a long moment, we stood there in the dark, the weight of it pressing down on both of us. I thought of my grandfather. I thought of the men who'd vanished, the lives appended by secrets no one was supposed to survive learning, and I knew there was no good answer. I crouched and brushed dust from a brass plate bolted to the control panel. An inscription had been carved into the metal. "If you find this, leave it buried." I swallowed hard. "Elena," I said, my voice low, "take photos, every angle, every serial number. We need a record before it disappears again." She nodded, her hands shaking as she retrieved her camera. The flash flickered in the gloom, capturing moment after moment. I knew then that whatever came next, I'd crossed the final threshold. This wasn't research anymore. It was evidence. And evidence was the most dangerous thing you could hold. When we were done, Elena turned to me. "What now?" she asked. I looked at the generator one last time, feeling something close to grief. "Now," I said quietly, "we decide if the world is ready to know what we've stolen from it." After Norfolk, I knew we were out of time. We'd pushed too far, peeled back too many layers. There were no more half measures left. Either we revealed everything, or we disappeared into the same quiet oblivion that had swallowed every witness. Before us, Elena and I left the generator locked in its crate. We carried the photos, the serial numbers, the logs, proof enough that it existed, even if we never got another chance to see it again. On the drive back north, we didn't speak much. The road unspooled in the headlights, mile after mile of asphalt that felt like a final corridor. I thought about how many people I'd lost to this search. Maya, forced into hiding. Basiago, whose life would always be defined by what he'd seen. Even Raphael, who hadn't returned my calls in days. The closer we came to the end, the more it felt like the only thing waiting for us was a choice no one should have to make. We reached Washington in the grey pre-dawn hours. I dropped Elena at a safe house, a small rented apartment she could vanish from at a moment's notice, and drove alone to a storage unit I'd leased under a false name. Inside were the drives containing everything I'd ever documented. The Montauk footage, the Vatican schematics, the project heist memos, the eyewitness interviews. It was more than evidence. It was the record of a crime committed across decades. I sat on the cold concrete floor and tried to imagine what my grandfather would have thought if he'd seen all this laid out in front of him. If he'd known the experiment that had stolen years of his life was only the first step in something larger. I wondered if he would have told me to walk away, if he would have forgiven me for not listening. I didn't have long to reflect. My phone buzzed with a text, an anonymous number I'd learned to recognize. One line, "Airfield, tonight. Bring everything." I read it twice. Then I powered the phone down and smashed it with a hammer. If they wanted to finish this, so be it. I spent the day preparing, packing the drives in foam cases, writing a statement, part confession, part manifesto that I planned to release the moment the story went live. By evening, I felt hollow, as though every emotion had been stripped away to make room for the task ahead. The airfield was an hour outside the city, a flat expanse of cracked tarmac, ringed by empty hangars. I drove in with my headlights off. The sky was low and clouded, the wind carrying the scent of rain. At the far end of the runway, a hangar door stood half open. Pale floodlights glared against the darkness, and in their glow, I saw him, Mr. Black, the same silhouette I'd glimpsed at the edge of my investigation. The man whose presence always marked a threshold I wasn't supposed to cross. He stood calmly, hands clasped behind his back, as if he'd been waiting years for this moment. I killed the engine and stepped out, the cases in my arms heavier than they should have been. "You made it," he called over the wind. His voice was unremarkable, almost kind. I didn't come here to negotiate, I said. No, he agreed. You came here because you're out of moves. I walked closer, stopping 10 feet away. From here, I could see the device behind him, a scaled-down version of the chronal generator. It pulsed with a steady, low hum that made the hair on my arms stand up. This is your last chance, he said. Hand over the evidence. Walk away. I shook my head. I don't think you understand, I told him. I'm not here to bargain. I'm here to end this. He tilted his head, studying me. You think the truth matters? He asked softly. You think anyone will believe you? I didn't answer. He sighed. Fine, he said. Then watch. He turned and keyed a command into the generator's control panel. A low vibration shuddered through the tarmac. The air blurred around the machine, like heat rising from asphalt. I took a step back. What are you doing? Demonstrating, he said calmly. If you insist on exposing this, you should understand the stakes. The vibration deepened into a resonance I felt in my teeth. A haze of blue light flared around the device, expanding until it formed a sphere twice the size of a man. Inside, the air churned with impossible, shapes-fractured images of places I couldn't name. Time isn't linear, he said. It's a river we can divert if we choose. But rivers flood. They drown everyone. I stared into the vortex, trying to process what I was seeing. You don't get to decide that, I whispered. His eyes found mine. For the first time, I saw something like regret in them. Don't be so sure. I reached for the satchel slung over my shoulder and pulled out a small transmitter. Device Raphael and I had rigged to trigger a simultaneous upload to every major news outlet, every archive, every server we could access. This is going live, I said. He took a step toward me, but before he could close the distance, a voice crackled in my earpiece. Signal locked, Raphael said. I pressed the button. All at once, the generator's sphere began to contract, its edges collapsing inward. A high-pitched whine filled the hangar, and the images inside flickered faster and faster. Mr. Black turned back to the control panel, his calm finally fracturing. You don't know what you've done, he shouted. I did. I'd made sure that truth was out of anyone's hands, including mine. The broadcast was live. Every document, every photograph, every interview. No one could bury it again. The sphere collapsed with a thunderous crack. A shockwave hit me square in the chest, knocking me flat. When I struggled to my feet, the generator was gone. Nothing remained but scorch marks on the concrete dot. Mr. Black was gone too. I staggered outside, the wind cold against my face. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. Somewhere, the records I'd fought to save were spreading faster than anyone could contain. But I knew the cost wouldn't end here. When dawn came, I found myself standing at the edge of the runway, the horizon turning pale gold. I took out the last thing I had left, my grandfather's postcard. I'm okay. Keep looking. I closed my eyes and let the wind tear it from my hand. The river of time might never be tamed, but at least now it couldn't be hidden. I turned and walked away, knowing there would be no going back. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to get more.